Alright, I believe this is part 14, and we are continuing with this kind of metaphysical jargon. So let's get right to it. With respect to the physical triad, by comparing the heathen accounts with similar passages in the scriptures, though not decisive, yet so preponderating that does the evidence appear to me upon this point, that if the school of Hutcheson had not failed to establish their very elegant hypothesis as to the fact that the fire, light, and spirit or air were only three different conditions of one and the same ethereal fluid, appearing as fire at the orb of the sun, as light proceeding from it, and as spirit returning to it, I should not have hesitated to subscribe to the opinion that such was the original trinity of the Gentiles, a triad nevertheless subordinate to a monad which existed in the form of ether previously to its assuming such conditions. I've said before that I just don't really understand this stuff all too much. It's really just kind of outside of the context of history for me. I mean, this is just going so far back into kind of like consciousness and reality that we live in. It's like talking about like when basically things didn't necessarily physically exist, but it's just talking about like the very, very, very basic and primeval stuff. And also keep in mind that the atomic theory wasn't necessarily refined or developed too much yet. So a lot of the stuff that he's talking about is not really in the focal lens of a modern scientist, not even to the slightest degree, I don't think. Like there's probably some like maybe a Newtonian stuff that might be in here, but it's definitely like just like what this part is saying right here, metaphysical. So there's really not a lot to unpack here. I'm hoping this is not going to go on for too long, to be honest, because this is not really what I want to extract from this book. This book is just a bunch of, or this part at least, is just a bunch of like, just stuff I really can't unpack, I'll be honest. So let's just try to like muscle through this and kind of get to the juicy stuff. The metaphysical speculations of the ancients upon this subject can only be derived by analogical reasoning from contemplation of the microcosm of man. To point out that the close analogy preserved in this particular between the metaphysical and physical system before explained, I would observe that man is a being compounded of an intellectual and of a material substance, both of which were conceived by the ancients to have pre-existed before they became united in the compound individual animal, the man. When thus united, they appear to have conceived a triad of intellectual powers, the intellect, the affection, feelings, or emotions, and the will or power of action. But for further illustration of these matters, and for such proof as can be produced, I must refer to the disquisition at the end. Upon this subject, therefore, I cannot agree with Mr. Faber in supposing that the Trinitarian speculations of the heathens originated in the coincidence of Adam and Noah being each the father of three sons. For of the three distinct analogical systems of the metaphysical, of the mind with its faculties and matter, the physical, of the ether with its conditions and chaos, and the human of the patriarch with his three sons, and the universal mother, the ark or earth. The last analogy is not only the most imperfect, but according to all historical accounts, demonolatry was introduced subsequently to the worship of nature and the elements. Okay, so I guess there's a little bit to unpack there, but I just want to focus on really just like the historical aspect of all this, and to say that like it kind of the stuff that he's saying before, where all this stuff's like kind of like an allegory, or we kind of like personify the elements and stuff like that. But I guess what Cory's trying to say here is that these things that we kind of revere or like dedicate as like a god or goddess to, like there's a goddess of rain, there's a god of storms, god of fertility, god of war, right? So like these are like kind of like personifications of like the ideas or the like kind of aspects of this world. But I think there's like a what Cory's saying is that there's like a biological or like some sort of aspect to all this mythology and all this like kind of like reverence of the like nature or natural elements and stuff and such, that in some distant past, like they were actual people but then turned into heroes, and then the heroes get like personified into like the elements and stuff like that. So like it's like how it got passed down. It's kind of like what I was saying a few videos ago, where the Aztecs, they kept their kind of knowledge on these like ancient legendary figures, right, through like some of the personifications of the elements. So whenever, like I said, whenever they saw a rain, they would say like, oh, it's Talak, you know what I mean, or they would associate that with him and the rain god and whatnot. It's really important, and I think that's something that like kind of like adheres to like human consciousness and memory, is like revering something as like somebody that was like a legendary or a legend in the past, and just kind of like personifying it through something that we see on an everyday basis kind of thing. It's like a more like I'd say like ambiguous or generalized version of like, somebody creating an idol and then worshiping it. Like they build like a nice sculpture and they're just like, oh, I'm gonna worship this. This is what I perceive to be the gods. You know what I mean? And like that is like idolatry. And then like what Cory's saying here, that like idol worship, right, was demonolatry after the worship of nature and elements. So it's kind of like blending the whole idea of like, when people started revering things as like something deeper than it once was, or what it was really originally intended to, that's where things get corrupt. And it's kind of, at least in this day and age when I'm reading this, it's really hard to like distinguish the truth now, because we have so much like distraction and so much like just kind of going on in the world now. We're exposed to so much like information today that like you can't get a grip on like the important stuff and like what's actually important, because you're so just every morning you're just thrown like so much information, whether it's something you like, whether it's something that's on the like political spectrum, whether it's something that happened in your neighborhood, it doesn't matter. There's just so much information, and it's at your disposal on your phone, on your television. Enough elaborating on that. Let's continue. From the widely dispersed traditions upon the subject, it is manifest that the circumstances of the creation and the deluge were well known to all mankind previously to the dispersion. Okay, that's consistent with some of the stuff that I'm looking at, alright? And the writings of Moses give to the chosen people not so much a new revelation as a correct, authenticated, and inspired account of circumstances. Again, this is what I'm saying, where as taboo as it sounds, some of these like religions are kind of taking and kind of corrupting and sanitizing these older texts and older like limelights of history and stuff. Yeah, I mean, whether or not you really like are a person of faith, that's just the truth. I mean, it really is the truth. These texts and some of the stuff that's in like the Old Testament is taken from much older documents that are in Mesopotamia. We have like evidence to prove this. There's plenty of stuff. You can look at Zachariah Sitchin's work. I think his work best kind of lays things out, and I think it's like kind of like the most logical way of approaching like something that like you can't really get a grip on. You know what I mean? Like there's some people who just don't care about like a non-human aspect to this world, or any type of like, like is there something here that like we don't know about? Is there a secret society like to which like goes far beyond anybody's imagination, at least in like a practical, realistic sort of sense? You know what I mean? Like anybody can like fantasize the idea of like a super alien power, like just kind of controlling the world. Like, it's easy to just say that, and it's like, oh yeah, they're super hidden, but it's like, in what ways or what operations do they kind of proceed with that keep them hidden from the public and have the control? You know what I mean? It's kind of like trying to explain that rather than just kind of just blatantly, I guess dogmatically kind of saying like, oh yeah, there's a super alien presence that's like kind of controlling the government, just kind of making really, really bold claims. But it's more of just like kind of saying, starting from something kind of small. Like I like to use secret society as like a way to explain these. So I'm just like, okay, well imagine like a secret society within our government structure that has like, that's in cahoots with other governments, and they plan these operations and all these like think tanks to do all this like type of like control on the population, because it's really hard to control a mass amount of people, and like things can go south really bad if the government's just like, oh yeah, there's aliens or what have you, there's World War III breaking out, there's a massive cataclysm from the sky coming down, or a meteor devastation, or anything like that. You know what I mean? Like things just go completely off the rails, and the order just completely dissipates. I mean, just looking at COVID-19 and seeing the toilet paper situation, I mean, that just gives you an example of how bad things can get very quickly. They can get very, very bad. So keeping the order and like control through like force and through like deception with these secret societies is one of the ways they do this, because you can't aim at an enemy you can't see, so to speak. You can't fight an enemy you can't see, and that's how they do it. Okay, so where were we? Accounts recognition partially obscured by the absurd and time and abused by superstition. The formless watery chaos and the ethereal substance of the heavens, enfolding and passing over its surface as a mighty wind, are the first principles both of the sacred and profane cosmogonies, but they are reclaimed by Moses as the materials created by the immediate agency of an almighty power. The subsequent process of formation so completely corresponds in both systems that if they were not borrowed from one another, a position which cannot be maintained. Yeah, like I'm saying, it's like, this is just kind of the stuff I say about Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. It's like the stuff that's going on in those areas are so similar, it's hard to say that one is not borrowing from the other or had borrowed from the other and then diverted at some point. I mean, come on. You got temples that look like ziggurats. You got a rain god, right? There's a rain storm god, right? So you have Talok. You have like a god of wisdom, which is like, I don't know. You say it's Enki or like Thoth or whatever, and then you have like Enlil, which is like the like super god or like storm god, right? So and then they also have like a flood story in the Popol Vuh. We know that. They talk about these like bird and jaguar people who have like great powers and whatnot. I mean, because the Popol Vuh has some like actual history to be founded upon, on top of like a legendary history, and I can't emphasize this so much. I've said it so many times. At what point are how much are they going to do this thing where they're going to just keep saying all this ancient history stuff is all legendary, all mythology, there's no claim or basis to it, because some of the stuff is just like a supernatural phenomena that's being described or whatnot. But it's like they reject it because they want to keep the whole evolutionary narrative thing going on, where it's like back then they didn't have any advanced technology. And it's not possible. Cycles of civilization, rises and falls, are not possible. There's only one instance of a civilization, and that's us. Yet there's ancient ruins that nobody has explanations for. Just saying. They must each have been ultimately derived from the common source of revelation. Similar considerations upon the traditions of a trinity, so universal among the nations, and an examination of what that trinity was composed, forces upon me the conviction that the Trinitarian doctrine, as it is now believed, was one of the original and fundamental tenets of the patriarchal religion. That the analogy between the microcosm, as pointed out, and the then current accounts of the creation became a stumbling block, which set mankind to refine upon the truth, that thence they fell into the errors of attributing eternity to matter, of placing a monad above the Trinity, with the pantheistic opinion that the deity was no other than the universe itself. Well, I mean, this is kind of like hard to kind of claim. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I do say that, like, you know, these legendary figures and these storm gods and stuff like that, like, it's more than just like a personification of the elements, and that it's referring to like an ancient hero in the past, or an ancient person, or an ancient group. But I mean, even that is just like, it's kind of hard to claim, because people, you know, they still strongly stand by this statement here, with, like, you know, just things being personified, nothing more. There's no legendary aspect to it. There's no ancient history aspect to it. There's no advanced technology aspect to it at a distant past. It's all just fictitious, I guess, translation, or for some reason these people kept fictitious knowledge with them. They set aside these natives and stuff like that, right? As much as they, like, are in hostile lands, right? Hostile environments to survive in, right? You're being tested against your survivability by being, like, you know, a native in a tribe and whatnot, and throughout the many eons that natives and very primitive folk that I'm speaking about, like, you know, very, very early, what we call civilizations in our era, right? So we're talking about early hunter-gatherers and whatnot, not just natives. But what I'm saying is, like, with the amount of, like, hostility that is brought upon them, they just decided to keep fictitious knowledge with them. They decided to keep all these allegories of, like I said, personifications of the elements, and they just had time to just set that aside. They just had time to do all that, just like they had all the time to build the pyramids and build all these great structures. You know what I'm saying? To do all this, and we just kind of just give that the blanket. We just blanket the answer that, like, oh, well, they had all the time in the world, or I don't really know, honestly, because I mean, looking at this, like, in this perspective, I don't buy the whole idea that, like, these natives were just keeping fictitious knowledge with them. That's just bogus. And anybody who says that is really just, like, a thorn in the whole like, and they're just, like, adding to the corruption of history. Because, like, when you start saying that these people who are, like, just trying to survive harder than you are, that they're keeping fictitious knowledge with them, it's so rude. It's so rude, it's ignorant, and like, some of these dumbasses in our academics think it's okay to start spouting that knowledge, and they've been doing this before I've been born, and it just doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't. I mean, honestly, at this point, like, I think there's some merit to what these people were saying back then. And, like, now I feel like we're at a turning point in this day and age where, like, we need to start looking at what the ancients were talking about, and then kind of, like, think twice, because it's not just mythology. They weren't just keeping all this information just to screw around. It was, like, engraved in their culture. These are people who were here and survived harder than any of us could. We just go to the grocery store every morning. would just drive straight to work and not have any worry about, like, am I gonna run into like a freaking wild animal? Am I gonna run into like a raider group? You know what I mean? We don't worry about that stuff. The only thing we worry about is, am I gonna satisfy my luxuries today? Am I gonna satisfy myself today? That's all we think about nowadays. So, like I said, dumbasses. So, excuse my French, but I'm really putting my foot down with the way we're being told history, because I 100,000% believe it's not being told correctly. And I think everybody can unanimously agree, and I think if you're listening to this, you would definitely agree. So, sorry to go off on such a raging tangent. I just have my strong opinions on that whole idea, that the alternative history is also an acceptable history. Okay, so kind of forgot where we left off, so you just kind of shoot, I might have scrolled down too much. I forgot where I left off at. I kind of went off on a tangent. I know we read all this. Pantheistic deity was no other than the universe itself. Okay, the doctrine of the succession of worlds, the metempsychosis, and demonolatry would follow naturally enough by an extension of their system from the particular circumstances of the creation to those attendant upon the deluge. The doctrine of the succession of worlds. Now, is this talking about like past civilization? I don't know what metempsychosis is. This kind of, I mean, I could look it up, but I'm not really sure if it's like that important of a word. And then let's see, breaking more of this down. By an extension of their system, a particular. I mean, I think it's basically saying, like, you know, the information that was kept by the survivors, and then the survivors were probably like this. I wouldn't say necessarily the strongest folk, but like the most like intellectually adept to, you know, survive, or maybe just blatantly lucky. That that they would have like passed down the knowledge, basically, and that people would have revered these peoples as like demons or spirits and whatnot, but it's really just like people from a very, very ancient past. I don't know. That's how I'm seeing it. And there's a technological aspect that I really can't explain, that I think nobody can explain because it's never explained. But there's definitely some sort of like hidden technology that many of us don't know about. I mean, there's so many just like UFO claims, paranormal phenomena, unexplained, you know. There's genuine inquiries on it. It's just some of it just gets blanketed over with what I would call just like deception, or like kind of distracting you from like finding out the truth, or even ponder about a truth, such as a non-human presence of that sort of like ideal. Because I think it takes a lot of effort to think and make that claim, especially if you're really trying to prove it, instead of just like making bold, not necessarily bold, but just kind of like goofy, facetious kind of claims, like saying like, you know, typical stuff like, oh, little green men, kind of downplaying the whole situation, you know. So by the pride of false philosophy, they forsook the truth of revelation and sunk into materialism, into the worship of the elements, of man and beast, and into idolatry, with all its attendant abominations. When they knew God, they glorified him not as God. Neither were thankful, but became in vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God gave them up to uncleanness, through the lusts of their own hearts. Well, yeah, I guess it's just, more of the same stuff we've been kind of like reiterating over and over. I don't think I need to explain that too much. To reclaim a world so fallen, the great manifestations of the Almighty from time to time have taken place, not only at the most civilized as well as celebrated periods of history, but upon the spots then best calculated for the general dissemination of truth among the heathens. The geographical situation of Palestine, chosen it may be for the seat of a universal empire, is the most remarkable upon earth for the facility of communication which it affords with every quarter of the globe. At the time of the Advent, it formed, as it were, the boundary of the rival empires of Rome and Parthia, subject to Rome, but holding an intimate connection with its colonial offsprings with the Parthian dominions. Sorry if my stomach's kind of loud. I'm getting kind of hungry, actually. I'm going to have to end this video here pretty soon, so I'll just kind of wrap things up on this last page. But I think we're getting kind of to the nitty-gritty stuff again. And its situation was at the time not more excellently adapted for the universal diffusion of the gospel, both in the East and West, than it was for the general instruction of mankind in times of old, when it formed so considerable a part of the high road communication between the empires of Egypt and Assyria. About the time of the 18th century, the most brilliant epochs of Egyptian history, the exodus of the Israelites was effected, and the fame of the miraculous exploits of Moses and Joshua was wafted in the Danaan colonies to Greece, with the fugitive Canaanites to the west, and carried by the Israelites themselves into the east. During the revolutionary violence consequent upon the downfall of the ancient Assyrian Empire, the same merciful providence kept up a communication with the kingdoms which sprung out of its ruins, by the mission of Jonah to Nineveh, by the connection of the princes of Samaria with Syria, and by the dispersion of the 10 tribes over the territories of the Medes and Assyrians by Salmanazar, and upon the full re-establishment of an empire at Babylon, a knowledge of the truth was diffused far and wide by the captivity of the Jews themselves. So I guess he kind of like pointed back to his claim earlier about some of the people from the Exodus went to Greece, and this started the Greek empires in the early Greek period, which was a blending of fugitive Canaanites and I guess smaller Jewish people from Egypt, which honestly, I think that's a fair claim. As much as that's not said in any of our history textbooks or like anything like that, I think that's a fair enough claim. Something that I looked at one time was Alexander had made a campaign to Egypt, right? So Alexander conquered a really big part of the Middle East, and he conquered pretty much all of Egypt. But he went on a special kind of spiritual journey, and I think he claimed that he had some descendancy or claimed some heritage or lineage to Egypt in some sort of way. I'm not exactly sure how, but if this is an explanation for that, I think it kind of fits in with history pretty well. I think it fairly puts it up. I don't think it's up much for debate too. Honestly, I think it's fair to claim that if an exodus did happen from Egypt, I think they would have definitely gone to Greece. Depending on how much military might they must have had. Somehow they must have had a huge amount of military might. I'm really not sure the extent, capabilities, I mean, all you're told in Exodus was that they just exiled themselves and then campaigned into Canaan with the help of God, right? So these godlike powers, man, they changed the world, I guess. So, all right, let's wrap this up. 10 tribes. Yeah. Okay, so I guess we'll just end it here. So I think that's good. So we'll start at the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar. This kind of whole paragraph right here is kind of like, it's one of those paragraphs where it shoots a lot of information at you, and it's kind of hard to like keep things, or like kind of keep tabs on like everything that they're saying, because there's just so much trying to like make some claims. But for the most part, I think they're just kind of like talking points, or just kind of things to refer back to when you're kind of going through more of this book, I'd say. So we're going to end it here and continue on the same page in this paragraph.